A human skull sits under a photographer's lamp. It has a hole in it, a perfectly round hole with smooth edges where new bone grew back. Someone drilled that hole deliberately. And then that person lived. Not for a day. Long enough for bone to grow back around the edges. Long enough to heal. Now ask yourself what system made that possible. Because the answer is not the one you expect. More than 1,500 skulls like that one have been pulled from Neolithic sites across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. 1,500. All showing the same thing. A deliberate opening. And healed margins. This was not an experiment. This was a practice. Miguel Faria documented it in Surgical Neurology International in 2015, case after case. Continent after continent. The same procedure. The same survival. Long before germ theory. Long before antiseptic. Long before anything you would recognize as medicine. In Jericho in 1958, excavators found one skull with 4 separate openings. 4 deliberate holes, and around every single one of them new bone had formed. 1 patient. 4 surgeries. Survived them all. Later surgical reviews confirmed something even harder to believe. In the Andes, Inca cranial surgeons achieved survival rates that astonished 19th century Western physicians when they first encountered the evidence. Trained surgeons, operating in fully equipped theaters, were looking at outcomes from 500 years earlier and struggling to explain them. Repeat operations. Healed bone. Practiced refined technique. These were not rituals. These were not accidents. But surgery alone cannot explain what you are about to hear. Because surviving the operation is one thing. Surviving the weeks that follow is something else entirely. Bioarchaeologist Lorna Tilley published a case in the International Journal of Paleopathology in 2011. The case was labeled M9, a person who had lived with severe paralysis for approximately 10 years. 10 years. The skeleton showed healed pressure lesions around the hips and back, fractures that had knitted together over time, and nutritional markers that told a story no one could argue with. This person was fed. This person was moved, regularly, by other hands, to prevent the wounds that come from lying still too long. This person was cleaned. Every day. For 10 years. By people who chose to do it. The bones do not tell you what those people felt. They tell you what those people did. And what they did is harder to explain than any surgical technique. But here is where it goes deeper. Because this was not unique to Homo sapiens. Serge Lebel and Erik Trinkaus described a Neanderthal jaw dated between 169,000 and 191,000 years ago. That jaw showed bone remodeling around the tooth sockets. That jaw had survived months without chewing. That is older than your species. Someone brought food to a Neanderthal who could not feed himself. Someone tended wounds. When that pattern repeats across sites, across species, across hundreds of thousands of years, it is not sentiment. It is evidence of organized, deliberate care running as a system. You carry the echo of that system in your instincts. When you feel the pull to help someone who cannot help themselves, you are running behavior that is older than humanity itself. A community made a 10-year commitment to someone who could give them nothing in return. That commitment is written into bone. And it is the clearest evidence we have that ancient survival was never a solo act. None of that care, none of that survival, explains where the medical knowledge came from. How did anyone know which plant cleaned a wound? How was that knowledge held and transmitted accurately across generations without a single written word? In 1991, a body came out of the ice high in the Ötzi Alps. He had been frozen there for 5,300 years, and he was carrying something. A compact bundle arranged like a kit, not random, not ceremonial. Inside it, researchers found a folded strip of birch fungus, a small leather pouch packed with plant fragments, a flint blade stained with organic residue, prepared tinder, traces of charred birch fungus consistent with wound treatment. Patrick Hunt and the conservation teams analyzed the pollen and chemical residues from that bundle, They found antiseptic compounds in the birch fungus. They found botanical traces consistent with wound care and dressing. The items were organized. They were prepared. They were carried deliberately into high mountain terrain where an injury could be fatal. That was not superstition. That was a hunter who had planned for injury, who knew which compounds cleaned a wound, who had assembled and packed that knowledge before stepping into terrain where anything could go wrong. He knew exactly what it was for. And then the same knowledge shows up again. 3,000 years later. Written on papyrus in Egypt. In 2019, archaeologist Karen Hardy published a molecular analysis of plant residues recovered from several Near Eastern sites. Hardy found that a clear majority of identified plant species had documented medicinal uses. At one site, residues on containers and tools matched opium poppy and antiseptic fungi. That is not coincidence. That is a record of deliberate selection, tested across generations, kept because it worked, discarded when it did not. The Ebers Papyrus, dated around 1,500 years before the Common Era, records honey as a wound dressing and willow preparations for pain relief. The evidence for both goes back far further than the papyrus. The papyrus just wrote it down. 19th century chemists isolated salicylates from willow bark. Those salicylates became the chemical ancestor of aspirin. Willow bark. Honey on a wound. Written down 3,500 years ago. The compound isolated in a 19th century laboratory. Your pill bottle on your bathroom shelf this morning. One unbroken chain. 5,000 years. Landing in your hand. That is not an accident of history. That is accumulated empirical knowledge, tested and passed forward by people who could not write it down, who carried it in practice, in memory, and in the hands that showed other hands what to do. But that system had a limit, and when populations grew past it, the remedies that had worked for 200,000 years stopped being enough. Agriculture concentrated people, animals, and waste into permanent settlements. That change gave pathogens corridors they had never had before. The same density that allowed knowledge to accumulate and spread also allowed infection to travel faster and farther than any remedy could follow. A team led by Louis Quintana Mercy at the Institut Pasteur used ancient genomes to show that immune genes were significantly reshaped during the Neolithic and Bronze Age as disease exposure rose sharply. At Catalhoyuk and other early towns, archaeologists found skeletal markers and pathogen residues that tell a story of repeated outbreaks overwhelming the local systems that had kept smaller communities alive. The plants that healed a hunting party of 12 could not stop a plague moving through a city of 10,000 people packed into permanent streets. The system had worked for 200,000 years. And then density broke it. But there is a third pillar. And unlike the others, you cannot read about it in an archive or find it on a skeleton. You can feel it. Because it is operating inside your body right now. In 2016, researchers at the Max Planck Institute and at Institut Pasteur published converging analyses of ancient human genomes. Michaela Dannemann, Johannes Kelso, and colleagues traced fragments of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA into the human immune system, specifically into the toll-like receptor cluster, the part of your immune system that fires first when something invades. 2 independent institutions. The same finding. Those archaic variants changed the threshold for detecting danger. They amplified early inflammatory signaling in some populations, likely increasing survival against the pathogens those communities were actually encountering. They also raised allergy and chronic inflammation risk in later life. That trade-off was not a mistake. It was a calibration built for a world that no longer exists, running inside a body that does. Those variants sit in your genome right now. When your immune system fires fast against an infection, when you develop seasonal allergies, when your body over-responds to something that should not harm it, you are feeling the legacy of a survival adaptation inherited from people who were not quite human, who lived and died in a world your species had not yet fully claimed, and who helped make you harder to kill. The speed of your immune response was calibrated by people who were not quite human, 40,000 years before you were born. You are not observing this history from the outside. It is running inside you, every single day. So, what was the system? 3 things. working together. Not one, all three. The first was pragmatic pharmacopoeia, Karen Hardy's residues, Ötzi's kit, the Ebers papyrus, the opium poppy on Near Eastern tools. Ancient communities built and maintained pharmaceutical knowledge through observation, experiment, and inheritance. They kept what healed, they discarded what killed, and they passed the remainder forward with precision that crossed millennia without a single word of writing. The second was organized caregiving. Lorna Tilley's case M9 is the clearest evidence in the archaeological record. A person who could not have survived a single week without deliberate, coordinated help from others, who lived for 10 years. The trepan skulls with healed margins point to the same system. Surgery requires aftercare. The procedure is only the beginning. The third was archaic immune inheritance. Dannemann and Kelso at the Max Planck Institute and teams at Institut Pasteur documented Neanderthal and Denisovan variants in the toll-like receptor cluster. Those variants tuned early inflammatory responses in ways that shifted survival odds against the specific pathogens those populations encountered. It cost something in later life. It paid for itself in survival. Ötzi's pack, the healed skulls, the residues on Near Eastern tools, the variants in your genome. None of these alone explains how a small species survived 200,000 years without hospitals, antibiotics, or written medicine. But all three together, running simultaneously, shifting the risk of childhood and injury and infection just enough, made survival across decades possible. And then, made you. If this changed how you see your body and where it came from, the next film asks how domestication rewired the world and why. They made you who you are today. You are not just the product of everything that went right. You are the product of everyone who stayed.